Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers. I'm Jim Papandrea. This podcast is a production of Catholic Culture. Sign up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/newsletter. Today we continue our series on the Doctors of the Church with our second episode on St. Albert the Great, famously the teacher and mentor of St. Thomas Aquinas. And yet there is actually so much more to St. Albert's career than teaching philosophy and theology. Believe it or not, St. Albert the Great has been called the father of veterinary medicine because he studied the physiology of animals, including figuring out how they reproduce. He usually did this by patient observation, though he didn't shy away from some under-the-radar dissection, which was illegal at the time, and which sometimes got him accused of practicing magic, and I'll have more to say about that later. But he probably knew more about animals than anyone alive in his time, and he busted some of the ancient myths about animals. For example, a few of the church fathers had used the pelican as a symbol of Christ because they thought the pelican feeds its offspring on its own blood. As intriguing as that image is, St. Albert's response was to observe real pelicans and then report, "Sorry, but real pelicans don't actually do that." The point is that he was using the scientific method: observation, experimentation, and repetition. That is, can the observation be repeated? You come up with a theory through observation, you test that theory through experimentation, and if the experiment can be repeated with the same results, then you can consider the theory, at least provisionally, sound. Now, St. Albert didn't necessarily invent the scientific method, but because of him, it became the standard in Europe. He probably also knew more about the human body than most doctors. And although he was born 400 years before the invention of the telescope, he studied the moon and figured out that the shadows are craters. He knew how to make gunpowder, and he knew that the world is a sphere. And both Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci learned that from him. And 600 years before St. John Henry Newman, St. Albert understood and taught the concept of the development of doctrine. That is, how doctrine comes to be increasingly clarified over time, yet without becoming corrupted or evolving into something it never was. St. Albert was also a systematizer of moral theology, using reason to apply logic to the discernment of right from wrong. And you may have heard that St. Thomas Aquinas is famous for bringing Aristotle into the conversation of medieval Christian philosophy and theology. Well, it was actually St. Albert who did that. He's the one who introduced Aquinas to Aristotle by writing commentaries and lecturing on Aristotle so that Aquinas could introduce Aristotle to everyone else. In fact, St. Albert was already as much of an expert on Aristotle as any Westerner could be well before his engagement with the non-Christian philosophers. That is to say, he had already mastered everything that the Latin scholars had of Aristotle's writings, so that when more were reintroduced in Europe by the Arab translations, by the time he arrived in Paris where he could read them, he was poised to become the world's top scholar of philosophy. Well, that is until his student, St. Thomas, surpassed him. But it was St. Albert who first read the influential Jewish philosopher Maimonides and the influential Arab philosophers Averroes and Avicenna, and introduced their theories to the Christian world, and then set St. Thomas on a path that would lead to him really revolutionizing Christian philosophy, making it important in a way that it hadn't been since the apologists of the 2nd century, like St. Justin Martyr. Now, as we noted in a previous episode, in some ways it was actually St. Anselm of Canterbury who first brought philosophy back. So if I can use a volleyball analogy, St. Anselm of Canterbury served it, for St. Albert the Great to set it, and St. Thomas Aquinas to spike it. But Averroes in particular had interpreted Aristotle, correctly or incorrectly, in ways that were not compatible with Christian theology. So before Aristotle could be used by St. Thomas, he had to be rehabilitated, so to speak, by St. Albert. St. Albert wrote paraphrases of Aristotle's writings that both corrected non-Christian interpretations and Christianized them, in effect, making his own interpretations of Aristotle informed by his own philosophical reasoning. Now, St. Albert the Great is generally acknowledged as the most prolific medieval writer. I couldn't find a complete list of his works, but I did find one author who said that nobody knows how many books he wrote. He wrote multiple commentaries on the Bible, prayers for the liturgy, and a book on the liturgy called The Sacrifice of the Mass, and another book on the Eucharist, though the authorship of these books on liturgy is disputed by some scholars. He wrote and preached many sermons, including multiple sermons on the Blessed Virgin Mary. In fact, really all of his works are dedicated to her. He wrote a treatise called 230 Questions Concerning the Blessed Virgin, which was a kind of commentary on the angel visitation to Mary at the Annunciation in the Gospel of Luke, but using logic to answer all kinds of questions like, how old was Mary when Jesus was conceived? St. Albert said she was in her late 20s, but he also explained the opposing theories. And in this, you can see where St. Thomas would get his methodology, because Albert was intent on being as thorough as possible, outlining the questions and all the options for answers, and even the arguments against his answer before finally giving his response. He wrote commentaries on Aristotle and Euclid. He wrote a Summa Theologiae, which contains a chapter on the errors of Aristotle, and this was meant to be a reference book for professors who didn't have access to a library. And he wrote a Summa de Creaturis, all the creatures. In fact, his writings on botany, zoology, mineralogy, and other branches of natural science, well, we might as well say he wrote an entire encyclopedia. And he wrote commentaries on Peter Lombard's Sentences, which, up until this time, was the primary book for scholastic theology. We probably can't overestimate the importance of Lombard's Sentences, and it was St. Albert the Great who took them to the next level. And St. Albert was a songwriter. As far as I can tell, most of his songs were songs in praise of the Mother of God. And it was said that often one could hear him singing alone in the cloister, his voice cracking and choking with his tears. And when other scholars of his time had questions, or questioned the teachings of any of their colleagues, they wrote to St. Albert the Great to settle the dispute and to get the final answers, sometimes to the point where he got a little annoyed with some of their questions. But St. Albert understood that you don't have to agree with everything someone says to find them useful or perhaps even edifying. He read the Jewish and Muslim scholars, but he also critiqued their writings, and he critiqued Plato and Aristotle, all from an Orthodox Christian point of view. And so it should go without saying that the legends, not to mention the claims of modern spiritualists and New Agers, of him doing everything from practicing magic, alchemy, and astrology to building a robot, are certainly not true. Most of these are too ridiculous for me to even dignify by mentioning them, but you will hear these things or see them written in books from time to time. And there are some medieval magic books that are sometimes falsely attributed to St. Albert. And never forget that anyone can contribute content to Wikipedia. And so it is that, much like St. Hildegard of Bingen, those who want to try to be apologists for alternatives to Christianity will sometimes claim the geniuses of our tradition as their own. But the proof that St. Albert was not into magic or astrology is that he adamantly taught that not even the magi of the gospel were magicians or astrologers. He said they were scientists and astronomers, but not magicians or astrologers. About Aristotle, he said, "If you believe that Aristotle was a man, then no doubt he could make mistakes like the rest of us." And that's actually a good thing to remember, that St. Albert admitted he could make mistakes. In fact, it's worth reminding ourselves that even doctors of the church can be wrong about something from time to time. St. Augustine took predestination too far, and as we noted, some claim that St. Bernard did not accept the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And there's a question mark over how St. Thomas understood that doctrine as well. So, being declared a doctor of the church does not mean that someone is infallible. Like many medieval scholars, St. Albert the Great was heavily influenced by the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius. Now, some of you may remember that we did an episode on Pseudo-Dionysius in this Way of the Fathers podcast, and I'll include a link to that episode in the description. But in case you don't remember, he's the one who was thought to be the very Dionysius the Areopagite who was brought into the church by the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, and who, according to tradition, would become the first bishop of Athens. Today, most scholars, though not all, most dismiss the traditional authorship of these documents, as I talked about in that episode on Pseudo-Dionysius, and which is why we refer to him as Pseudo-Dionysius. And the consensus seems to be that he was a 5th century philosopher who wrote, among other things, a book called Mystical Theology. And by the 13th century, this book had become a kind of textbook in the universities. Since they thought the Mystical Theology was written by a 1st century convert of St. Paul, it was treated as an apostolic writing. So, St. Albert lectured on the Mystical Theology and wrote a commentary on it, explaining its very esoteric themes to a medieval scholastic audience. I say it's esoteric because it's full of statements like, "Ignorance of God is the truest wisdom." In other words, the idea that the path to knowing God begins with the confession that we can know nothing about God. And this is the epitome of what is often known as apophatic or negative theology. You say something about God by saying what God is not. Even talking about the attributes of divinity is really saying what God is not. To say God is all good is really just saying that God is not the author of evil. To say that God is all-powerful is really just saying that God is not limited in power in any way. To say that God is omnipresent is really just saying that God is not limited by space. And to say that God is eternal is really saying that God is not limited by time. You get the idea that it's too dangerous to try to say positive things about God, so we get to it through the back door by saying things about God that describe what God is not. But when St. Albert comes to this, what he was doing is trying to find the balance of both the negative theology, saying what God is not, and some measure of positive theology, saying something affirmative about God. And he believed that that was necessary, that this balance was essential. But in order to get there, St. Albert believed that you have to take a step back and first talk about how it is that we even know what we think we know. Now, you probably already know this is called epistemology, theories of how the mind works to understand things. And St. Albert also believed we have to talk about the very meanings of words and how words represent the realities that we're speaking about. This is called semiotics, theories of how words have meaning. So if you read St. Albert, it's going to feel like you get a lot of philosophical speculation in these realms of epistemology and semiotics before he ever gets around to making theological points. And in fact, this is exactly the kind of speculation, influenced by the kind of logic you learn from pagan philosophy, especially Aristotle, that will attract criticism for being, well, too philosophical. And this is why St. Albert had to defend some of Aquinas' teachings to prevent it from being condemned by the Archbishop of Paris. One major thing that seems to be at stake was the debate over just how much or how accurately we can ever know God. Now, everyone would have agreed that in this life, we can't know God as he really is. We see through a glass darkly, as St. Paul said. But some took this negative theology to the extent that they were saying, or seemed to be saying, that even in the afterlife, we can't know God as he really is. And to others, that sounded like it negates the beatific vision, which is why St. Albert took a more balanced view of how we know God and how we talk about God. And he said we need both the negative and the affirmative statements about God. At the end of the day, St. Albert would say that theology is a science, the science of what he called practical philosophy. That is, it's a science governed by logic. But it's not just a science, because that would imply that anyone could master it, even a non-Christian, and apart from a life of prayer and the Eucharist. No, St. Albert would say it's a science, but it's a science that has to be illuminated by grace and by a divine infusion of wisdom in those who are faithful and who meditate on the Scriptures. St. Albert the Great was a scholar, an author, a teacher, a bishop, and a preacher, preaching in Latin as well as in German. He's called the Universal Doctor because he studied everything. Virtually every branch of learning was under his microscope, as it were, from astronomy to zoology and everything in between. To him, he was simply studying all of creation for the glory of the Creator. In fact, I think he would say that the study of creation is a form of praise of the Creator. He was a contemplative and possibly a mystic, greatly influenced by the mystical philosophy of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. And by the time he died, he was already being considered a trusted authority on the level of someone like St. Augustine. In other words, at that time, if you wanted to make a point, you quoted one or more of the authorities who had come before you to support your arguments. You quoted someone that everyone would agree is trustworthy. But before this time, that had always meant it has to be someone who is no longer alive, one of the fathers of the past. And so what's so amazing about St. Albert the Great is that already within his lifetime, he was being quoted along with the fathers as one of them. And his contemporaries understood how rare this was, to the point where one called him the miracle of our time. In 1931, Pope Pius XI said that St. Albert was exactly the saint whose example should inspire this modern age. He was referring to the fact that St. Albert was able to bring together faith and reason, revelation and science, in a way that did not put them in competition. And this was right at the time that some were claiming science made religion obsolete. And the backlash of that was the emergence of Christian fundamentalism. The famous Scopes so-called monkey trial was only 6 years earlier in 1925. And so St. Albert was declared a doctor of the church precisely at this time in history, to some extent to make the point that the Catholic Church does not choose between faith and reason, but embraces them together, and that Catholicism does not pit the church against science. On the contrary, the Catholic Church has always been the greatest patron of science and the arts. Now, it's interesting, or perhaps ironic, that these last two doctors of the church that we've looked at, St. Anthony of Padua and St. Albert the Great, who were so influential on the Franciscans and the Dominicans, respectively, and who were so instrumental in the formation of St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas, respectively, well, they turn out to be perhaps the two most obscure and the two least accessible doctors of the Church, at least for a modern English-speaking audience who may not be as into philosophy as the scholastics were. And I think that St. Albert is even less accessible than St. Anthony. So, what's your entry point into studying more about St. Albert should you want to? There isn't a lot written on him, at least not in English. And when I went to my usual books to do the research for this podcast, anthologies of medieval scholars and the like, he's often completely overlooked. overshadowed, of course, by his more famous student Thomas Aquinas. In fact, in the Classics of Western Spirituality series, he has to share a volume with Thomas, himself getting less than half the book. Nevertheless, if you want to learn more about St. Albert and read some of what he wrote, you should start with that volume on him and Thomas in the Classics of Western Spirituality series. And then, if you find him inaccessible or too philosophical, at least you still have your gateway into Aquinas right there in the same volume. The volume includes an in-depth introduction to St. Albert, including a section on his engagement with Pseudo-Dionysius, and then his commentary on the mystical theology, with a good translation of the text of the mystical theology and a commentary on the commentary. So look for a link in the description to that volume. And now I'll end with a prayer by Pope Pius XII. May St. Albert, who in his own very difficult times proved by his wonderful work that science and faith can flourish harmoniously in men, through his powerful intercession with God, arouse the hearts and minds of those who devote themselves to the sciences to a peaceful and orderly use of the natural forces, the laws of which, divinely established, they investigate and seek after. Amen. Next time, on The Way of the Fathers, St. Bonaventure. Thanks for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.